In the design of everyday things, Donald Norman talks about the 7 stages of action. We're going to use the 7 stages of action in order to break down what a player is doing and understand how their mind is breaking down the tasks at hand. Now, the design of everyday things is talking about the design of doors and phones and computer software, but games are computer software, and when we're talking about users, you're going to have the 7 stages of action. They're just going to have different goals and mindsets behind those actions. In the 7 stages of action, we have forming the goal, forming the intention, specifying an action, executing the action, perceiving the state of the world, interpreting the state of the world, and evaluating the outcome. Now, you might not be able to break that all down without a real-world example. And what happens when I walk into my own office to work on this podcast, the first thing I'm going to probably do is think about whether or not I have enough light in the office. Now, in this case, my office has a lamppost that's at my desk that I have to cross the room. So I've assessed whether or not there's enough light, which there is not because I turn my lights off when I leave the room. So the first thing I'm going to do is form the goal of turning the lights back on. So the first thing I'm going to have to do is form a goal that I want more light. Now I have to form the intention of how do I get more light. Well, for me, my lamp is going to be next to the desk across the room. Other people may have light switches on the wall. But we're going to specify an action that we are going to need to do, walk across the room or walk to the wall and flip a switch. Once we've decided what action we're going to take, we're going to execute that action. We're going to figure out what that action did. And then we're going to decide whether or not that's the action that we wanted. My original goal of wanting more light is still there, but now I'm going to have to figure out if this lamp has a bad bulb or it's unplugged or something like that. We want to use these 7 stages of action when we're talking about game players. Now, following up on these rules, we have the gulf of execution and the gulf of action. These are different concepts that we use to think about how users are going to interact with different software. So in terms of the gulf of execution, what we're talking about is when players or when users are going to be using a piece of equipment and they intend to do something. So a gulf of execution is when a user intends to do something by creating an action or picking an action, for instance in our light example, but even though that action doesn't create the desired results. Now, when we're talking about usability, we're talking about eliminating as many execution steps in order to make it effortless to get to the goals that we want. We want to eliminate anything that's between you and your goal. And this is actually one of those spots where game design is slightly different because sometimes we actually create a gulf of execution on purpose. Take, for example, most horror games. In certain horror games, especially the ones that are over the shoulder or third person and third person stationary camera, what you're going to have is a very awkward control scheme where players are going to have difficulty moving the correct way even though their intent is to move to the left. Perhaps that the level is slightly askew or there is a camera angle that's a little bad. When you're playing horror games, you're actually getting a lot of that on purpose. The game designers are intentionally making that game more difficult. The game designers are intentionally making that game more awkward and more difficult, hopefully, if they're doing their job right. And if they're not, then that's going to be a Although we shouldn't let them off the hook all the time, because I'm sure that there are some examples that we can all bring up of when a horror game is just bad. When we're talking about the gulf of evaluation, what we need to think about is what a user is going to look at a system, for instance a game, and understand or not understand about that system. So here's one extremely valuable example. For video games, we have a large gulf of evaluation between the game controller and the player. There's a generational gap that is not crossed, that people above a certain age are going to have a lot more difficulty working with controllers like the typical Xbox, PlayStation controllers, which have a two-handed control scheme, a D-pad, and a set of buttons. That is one thing Nintendo sought to eliminate when we're working with the Nintendo Wii. Now, for students who are under a certain age, playing with their parents may not have been a weird thing in their home because they had this Wii device. Now, the Wii did something very, very unique, which is they eliminated most of the gulf of evaluation when working with games. What they did is they took the controller and they turned it on their side, much like a remote control, which more people are used to because they've been around it for a long time. They used to call a remote a clicker back when they were in analog days, back in the analog days. So they've been around for long enough that the older generation actually got what it was to use that controller in a way that they would never have done with a D-pad and A and B buttons like the original NES controller. And Nintendo's main goal was actually to sell a lot of these consoles to older generations in order to make a family gaming experience instead of a youth gaming experience or a under 30 gaming experience. And they were able to get new customers that have never played before. And it wasn't that people were too old to play games. They weren't able to get across the gulf of evaluation in order to interact with the software at all. And that's one thing that you should also think about when you're working on games and you're developing games. Our interaction with computers is just beginning, and we're just understanding how to work with things. In the past 20 years, we've gone from regular D-pad controllers to motion controllers to touch screens to humanoid sensing devices, and we've also had games that have run off of your heartbeat and your breath rate. And we're even seeing people playing games with their blood as they start checking their insulin levels as games become available that help players, as games become available that help kids keep track of their diabetes information. And that's actually one of the really amazing things about the game industry and the game field as it stands now. We started off in a very strange place in games, and we're only growing. In the past 20 years, almost no one could have projected the trajectory of the video game industry as it stands now, and it's only going to diversify over time. We've got games that are serious games, and we've got games that are games for change. We have games that approach every aspect of life. There is even a small study about surgeons playing Super Monkey Ball, which was an old game for the PlayStation 2, and how that it was increasing the efficiency of their ability to use laparoscopic surgery tools. Because in the game, the same kind of movements are in a fun way presented that the laparoscopic tools represent. And that's actually where we get down to Schneiderman's 8 golden rules of interface design. But this usability advice is pretty general purpose, especially in the games field, so we're going to go over it. The first is to strive for consistency when we're talking about visual language. So sequences of actions are going to have to require similar situations. In other words, when you're working with a player, and so for instance in Assassin's Creed, when you want to make a leap of faith jump, what you need to do is you need to find a set of pigeons that are on a corner of a roof. If you do that and you approach the pigeons, they fly away, but you can jump off without ever looking down and have the reliability that there's going to be a hay wagon at the bottom. So a second thing is to enable frequent users to use shortcuts. You want your expert users to be able to play your game better than you can. So for instance, in Word, you can copy and paste by right-clicking and going through the menu, or you can hit Control-C in order to copy and Control-V in order to paste. That's what frequent users are going to do and are going to be able to learn throughout frequent playtime. So offer informative feedback. One of the things that drives everyone nuts, and I'm sure if you've ever played a game, you came to a point where you wanted to do something and you made that action and you made an action happen, but nothing happened afterwards. Maybe you hit a box and nothing happened. Well, one of the things you need to do as a game designer is offer informative feedback. Now what that means is maybe it's a flash, maybe it's health, maybe it's a special effect, maybe it's a sound effect, maybe it's all three. But whenever you take an action upon the world in a game, you need to have a consequence for that action. Now, the other thing you need to do is design dialogues to yield closure. What you're going to want to have is you're going to have different sets of gameplay elements that are going to happen within each area. Now, I can actually apply this more to level design, which we're not going to get into in depth, but think about it this way. Every single scenario has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The player wanted to do something, the player did a thing, and then the player evaluated whether or not they can do that thing. What you must do is give the information on whether or not the player did that thing or not. So you also need to offer simple error handling. If you're going to talk about Super Meat Boy, they offered and permitted easy reversal of actions by allowing the player to spawn over and over again without any penalties. Are the most important rules of all. Support an internal locus of control. That rule basically means that a designer needs to create a system that allows the player to feel like they have authorship and control over what they're doing. So for instance, in the original Prince of Persia, players often pushed the jump button but didn't actually jump. That pissed off everyone, but the reason for that was that the jump button would trigger a jump at the end of the animation, which was, I forget exactly how many frames, but I believe 6 or 7, and those 6 or 7 frames would have to play. So in actuality, you had to jump way earlier in order to trigger the correct control. That was a very confusing thing for most players, and that was not a good example of internal locus. And finally, reduce the short-term memory load. Humans only have the ability to remember so many things. So if you need to give the player the ability to keep track of scores, or for instance in most modern games, you have a quest log, because if the player is going to put down their controller or to pick up their controller again, you need to be able to provide them a quick way to refresh their memory. Now, all these rules are used in games, and I hope you look at your games through this aspect every single time you work on one. But not only do we work on games this way, we work on hardware that way, and we work on more important like the software that keeps the planes in the air.